then we'll stop recording at the end of the presentation for the Q&A. Unless Shun has anything you want to say, let's turn it over to April and Lauren and Gina.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. We're going to be talking today about something that's kind of a passion project for me, Lauren, and Gina. We've been writing a paper on this very topic for a few months now. And so it's nice to kind of, test it out with an audience to see how people react to what it is that we're putting on paper. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And let's go ahead and get started by talking about our multi-generational classrooms. So what we know at this point is that student populations in colleges and universities are diversifying across the ages of students. It's now very commonplace in our classrooms that we have an entirely multi-generational group of students. And graduate students over the age of 24 years old are now represented as the majority when compared to the total number of students enrolled in graduate programs, thus again representing generational diversity. As of 2019, the typical college classroom included learners across at least 3 or 4 generations. So it's possible that you have baby boomers, Generation Xers, millennials, and Generation Z individuals. And all of these students are coming into our classrooms with varying strengths, preferences on how it is that they learn or access material, and then needs that we need to meet as their professors. So here's a look, rather dense graphic that you can take a look at that lays out some varying strengths, needs, academic preferences, and then preferred training or educational approaches across the different generations. One thing we have to keep in mind as we're trying to teach to a classroom with this multi-generational group of people is that these adult learners tend to bring complex learning histories, including educational and life experiences that differ from their pre-adult other peer college learners. So for example, baby boomers, those born between 1944 and 1964, typically present as independent thinkers and clear communicators with a strong commitment to hard work. And this is due to a tribute to their cultural variables that were existent in their history. So World Wars I and II, the Civil Rights Movement, for example. And this history tends to vary greatly from millennials, for example, who were born between 1985 and 2002. And these individuals are considered to be the most educated and technologically literate at this point. They tend to have to expect constant or instant gratification and quick responses from their teachers and colleagues. So a generationally inclusive classroom is one in which there are clear and academically challenging expectations for all students who are involved. And this means that as professors, we have to design our courses such that we're considering how to incorporate strategies that make these expectations clear while creating learning opportunities that are relevant for each of these students, regardless of their generational learning skills. One thing we're going to talk about today, a lot of the strategies that we're going to talk about today are derived from applied behavior analysis. And when most people think of applied behavior analysis, it tends to be associated with work with individuals with autism or those with developmental disabilities and cognitive impairments. B.F. Skinner, one of the most famous behavior analysts, actually spent a lot of his time thinking about and researching different teaching techniques and strategies. So what we're going to talk about today has pretty heavy roots in Skinner's analysis of teaching, as well as some evidence-based education strategies. To get us started though, let's talk about what behavioral contingencies are. So basically, we know that people tend to behave when there are contingencies in place for behavior. For example, if I want you to turn your term paper in on time, I should set a deadline and make the consequence clear for meeting that deadline or exceeding the deadline. So now let's talk about how to promote even better contingencies that will promote classroom participation and learning in our multi-generational classrooms. So here's an example of how it is that you might go about promoting some clear contingencies in your classroom for these new digital classrooms that most of us find ourselves in. One of the things that we learned we had to do in the ABA program was to give our students a hybrid technology contract. Before COVID, our courses were actually hybrid, but now, of course, they're all online. But the contract still remains the same. The components are still important. So here's an example of what our contract looks like. And we go over this contract with our students in class, and then we set a contingency for them to sign this contract saying that they agree to upholding each of these pieces of the contract, and then they turn it in. So, you know, one of the things that we have learned is that something that's really important to students, regardless of generation, is points. They love earning points, right? Everybody's obsessed with their grade for the most part, even graduate students. Everybody's obsessed with the grades and the points. So what we've done in our program is that if students turn their signed contracts in on time, they earn 5 points. So we have found this to be extremely motivating for our students. One of the things that we've also tried to really focus on when meeting the needs of these generational learners is acknowledging that lecture might not always be the best method. Baby boomers tend to like the instructor-led, lecture-based type of course. However, other students from other generations seem to not be quite as impressed. So one criticism about using a lecture method is that students passively listen, and there tend to be few opportunities for them to actively respond during these types of classes. So student participation in lectures is often limited to voluntary responding, to indirect questions. So for example, you might ask questions to the class in general rather than pinpointing one or two individuals. And so what this means is that the rest of the students passively engage in the class. And what we know from research is that teaching procedures that encourage overt student responding, like answering questions out loud, produces higher scores than those that only have these overt responding opportunities, like reading or listening in class. And research also tells us that most students tend to prefer these more active opportunities in class. So let's talk a little bit about active student responding. This refers to a teaching technique that increases participation, and ASRs include things that we're going to talk about in a little bit, but using ASRs, it's a way for you to identify students who are learning in your classrooms and those who might not be learning. And with this information, you can determine when it's necessary to modify the learning opportunities such that you're making sure that you're meeting the needs of all of your students. So for example, student A may rarely respond during those active student response opportunities, and this might alert you that that particular student needs additional tactics in order to survive in your classroom or increase learning. So you might go ahead and provide some guided notes for your students so that they have this as a way to keep track of what's happening in the class. Choral responding is something we often equate with elementary school instruction, so you have your kids say everything together all at once. But believe it or not, this is something that you can use with college students too. It's another tactic that you can use to promote participation, and it allows all students, regardless of generation, to feel and learn and feel like they're connected to the class as a whole. And I have a video down here. I think we're gonna, for the sake of time, we're just gonna kind of leave it down there, and I'll post it in the chat for you guys so that you can see it later. And then another great strategy that promotes both the independence that baby boomers and Gen Xers desire, while also allowing millennials to contact group work, is to do what we call think, pair, share. So in this example, you can see on the PowerPoint that the PowerPoint that this student gets is different than the PowerPoint that the professor has. So the one that you post on Blackboard might be a little bit different. The one that you have available when you're actually teaching the class can have prompts for your behavior. So maybe it has things where you're asking the students to do certain activities. So for instance, you can present a question, you can ask students to jot down some answers, so that's the thinking part. Then you can pair them up and put them in Zoom breakout room groups where they can discuss what each of them wrote individually, with the idea that they hash everything out. So when you come back together, you can have a larger group discussion based on the information that students were asked to think about. So this is another tactic that not only allows you to address learning preferences of each of the generations, but you're also using the active student responding to increase active participation. And the student version of the PowerPoint could also serve as guided notes. So I tend to leave a lot of the things blank on the student version so they can fill it in while we're actually going through class. Another example is in-class writing exercises that you can associate with different class materials. And these have been demonstrated as another effective tool for increasing student responding. These exercises are typically designed to be short in length, and then they're followed by discussion. So it's very similar to what we just talked about with the think, pair, share. However, here, oftentimes what I tend to do is I go ahead and put my students in Zoom breakout room groups. I give an assigned question or an assigned topic to each of those groups. They talk about it. I typically give a time limit so that they know what to expect. They know when it's ending. And this way, they have the opportunity to kind of work together collaboratively, and then we can come back together and discuss as an overall group. So these exercises really allow students to draft their thoughts and share ideas from their own experiences in smaller groups prior to sharing with the large one. So aside from increasing self-awareness and self-reflection, this type of technique also fosters interaction and support amongst those smaller groups of students. And this can be great for millennials and Gen Z students who want higher levels of interaction with each other and with their professors and the use of technology. So one thing I often do here to incorporate technology into this exercise is I'll post these questions in a Google document, and I'll share that link with my students in the chat window when we're in class so they can see each other also working on their questions. It's a joint document that we have by the end of class. So it's something that they can have available and kind of take with them also when they leave the class, and they tend to really enjoy this. Additionally, for students who might be a little bit less tech savvy, those other generations might be able to help them, tackle these Google documents, so it makes it a little bit less overwhelming. Another technique that you might consider using, and this one is one that's kind of old school, and I have to admit that it's a little bit more challenging to incorporate whenever you're doing a digital classroom, but it's response cards. So response cards are cards or signs that students can simultaneously hold up, indicating their response to an instructor-delivered question. There's a lot of research to support the success of using response cards to increase the frequency and accuracy of student responding, increase scores on quizzes and tests, and then reduce disruptive behavior across students with diverse learning histories, including university students. So you could use response cards that are blank index cards, and that you could make this part of your course materials. So when I use this in class, I put this as like when you put your books into the system saying this is what you have to get for class, I'll add index cards as an additional piece of material that students have to purchase for the class. They are relatively inexpensive, so it's not something where you're asking students to spend a lot of money on these things, but they're something that they can use in class. So I have them do this, and then following student responding on the response cards, or what you do is you ask a question, right? Students respond, they hold up your card there, and then you can tell what the correct answer is. And this gives you, as the professor, an opportunity to elaborate. If you see that most of the class missed something, then maybe you need to go back and talk about it a little bit more so that students feel more comfortable with that material. Additionally, this is a great way to allow for some non-vocal participation, and this might be a benefit for students who maybe don't have a very good reinforcing history with speaking out in class. I'm sure most of you have seen that. You have students who just don't participate in the digital classroom, and this is one way to encourage that participation while also making it a little less scary to participate in class. So again, you can assess their learning. You can even assess class-wide or individually with response cards. So it's a great way to determine if you need to add guided notes, or maybe you need to incorporate more short writes with discussions to make sure students are contacting the information. I saw over in the chat window, Gina is talking about Zoom polls. And so yeah, next slide, this is exactly another option that you can incorporate into your classroom. So I don't know if any of you have tackled these Zoom polls in your classrooms yet, but it's a great way of assessing class-wide performance on the topic that you're discussing in class. And they're fairly easy to set up from the professor's perspective. So you can ask multiple choice questions and things like that, and you get very quick answers from your students. So it informs your behavior. It tells you whether or not you need to teach something a little bit differently, or contact it multiple times so that students understand what it is that you want them to take away from the class. And then Kahoot is something that I have not contacted in a while, but one of my former doc students introduced this during one of my classes, and it was a great tool that you can use in your classroom too. So it's an extra piece of technology which will really speak to the millennial and Gen Z individuals who might be in your classroom. The Gen Xers should also have no problems with this. We know they tend to be rather tech savvy, and perhaps they can assist anyone else who's struggling to use this type of technology. But this one, I like to think of this as another high-tech version of response cards. So it allows you to get that information from your students, but without requiring that they purchase those low-tech index cards that some students might not even know what those are at this point. So the idea here is that everybody downloads the app. You can add the questions to the poll. There's often a time limit for when students respond. It's meant to be rather quick and informative. Here you can assess class-wide performance, and one of the things I like about Kahoot is that you can also get individual scores to see which students might be struggling. So again, if you need to provide some individual supports like guided notes, or maybe inform some study groups in your class. Another strategy that you might find useful is interteaching. So for this one, students are provided with a preparation guide prior to the class period. And what this does is it contains questions that are designed to lead or guide the students through a reading assignment. So, some reading assignments are rather complex, and this is a great way to help students contact the material, but have kind of a little help to assist them along the way. So the idea is that students answer the questions before the class period, and then they are supposed to prepare to discuss their answers with fellow students in small groups. So you can put the students in pairs in Zoom breakout rooms where they can review their completed preparation guides. And as the instructor, as students, they can raise their hands, their virtual hands, and you as the instructor can pop around through different Zoom rooms and answer questions or guide the discussion as necessary. Once they complete these guides together, they complete a record sheet, basically identifying any areas that they still aren't quite sure about, or they might like you to elaborate on a little bit more in a different discussion, or for instance, at the start of the next class period. So this is another procedure that has been shown to lead to higher exam grades and higher rates of overall satisfaction in class compared to traditional lecture methods. And much like the writing and discussion exercises, interteaching allows students to practice learning from each other and developing collaborative relationships, while also possibly engaging in some conflict resolution if they have different answers. That's probably when they raise their hands the most, I have to tell you, in the classroom, when they can't come to agreement on an answer and they want you to come in and help figure out what the answer actually is. All right, so this is one that I have to tell you is not typically a favorite of my students, but this is another strategy for assessing student responding on a digital platform, and it's using vocal assessments or quizzes. So I like to call them assessments because it sounds a little bit less scary or aversive. You can let students prepare for these types of activities ahead of time by having them review their guided notes in those interteaching groups. Typically when I do this, the students don't know exactly which question from their guided notes will be the one that they get asked in class, but they know that the assessment is coming that day because it's clearly indicated on the syllabus. It'll say, we're having a vocal assessment on Tuesday. So these assessments can also be built directly into your PowerPoint slides for class. And what I do again is beforehand, I assign students their questions right on the PowerPoint slides. This way, I'm sure that I'm assessing everybody in the class. And when that slide pops up with the student's name on it, they automatically know what their individual question is. So to try to make this a little bit less aversive, I try to set it up kind of like a game where I have the students, I tell them they have the opportunity to earn points when their question is presented. And each student gets about 20 to 30 seconds to answer their question or to start answering their question before the question becomes open game for the rest of the class. So whichever student answers the question correctly, they earn the participation points for that class. And then if you were able to see from the chart earlier that some students, like Gen Xers in particular, really prefer real life scenarios. This meets their need for learning. And I know that this can sometimes be kind of a difficult thing to figure out how to incorporate in the digital classroom in particular. So this is another area where we really focus on building in some group activities, but with real life scenarios and outcomes. So again, each of these activities can be completed in groups, and it involves students applying what they've learned or what they've read in the class to real life situations. So they get to practice, again, collaborating with others, and they get the opportunity to practice things that they might contact in the field sooner rather than later. So here are just some examples of these types of activities that I've incorporated in classes. For instance, the Mythbusters one was a huge hit, where I gave them the myths that we were going to discuss, put them in groups, and told them which students were going to support the myths and which students were going to refute the myths. And then they had this little debate that went back and forth. It was great for me as the instructor because I got to see the students actually learn. I got to see what they took away from all of the classes, because part of this assignment was to support what they were saying with different readings or different citations as part of that process. Another activity that I actually do in my class I'm teaching this semester is having the students practice providing feedback. So that they are currently in their fieldwork experience. And, you know, as you guys I'm sure know who have field experiences in your programs, they don't always go the way that you want them to. Sometimes things happen that are not appropriate. Sometimes things happen that are great. And so teaching our students how to kind of stand up for themselves or speak up for themselves, I think, is a critical component. And we use this feedback model as a way for them to practice doing that. So we have these feedback scenarios almost every week in the class that the students practice. And then an example of another hands-on activity that we're actually doing tonight in class is my students are going to be broken out into groups of 3 individuals, and then they have to take the readings that we've covered in class thus far, the material in general that we've covered, and then they have to develop a staff training program based on that. Very simple and quick staff training program based on what we've covered. And then here's another technique that we've been testing out. I know Lauren started this a couple of semesters ago, but what we found oftentimes, and you probably see the same, is that students don't often attend office hours, particularly when they're on the digital platform. Even though, you know, we tend to think that people are more accessible right now, it still seems to be challenging. So what we've started doing is offering drop-in hours where we log on to our Zoom classrooms about 30 minutes before class, and we plan to stay about 30 minutes after class. So this way, students who might not otherwise attend office hours due to work or family commitments have an opportunity to meet with us and discuss questions, concerns, or even just ask for guidance in their professional world. So students tend to be more into this than they are attending those office hours. It's possible that they like these better because it doesn't require that they hunt down a different Zoom link, right? They just go to their classroom link and that's where they log in and they can find you before and after class. So it probably makes the response effort a lot easier for students. And this might be beneficial for students who are a little bit less tech savvy, right? They don't have to keep track of all the different Zoom links or find your office hours Zoom link. They can just log in like they're coming to class or stay afterward. So this is an opportunity for you to build rapport with your students who prefer those instructor-led opportunities and activities, while also giving additional learning opportunities for students who might be struggling in class. And like I said, we have found this to be particularly helpful for our practicum classes. So students get the opportunity to ask questions or troubleshoot issues. And it's been really helpful during COVID. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about, and this is, multi-generational or just in classrooms in general, thinking about how to create opportunities for choices. Most people like choices, and our students certainly seem to like choices. So I try to build in some choice opportunity during my classes on a regular basis. Here's an example of how I built choice into our final week of classes during the summer. So I knew that my students wanted to show me what they had learned throughout the semester, or I wanted them to show me what they had learned. But I also knew that they were quite burnt out for COVID at that point. We'd gone, from one semester directly into the other, and the students were really struggling. So I offered them a choice. I allowed them to take some time, to take some ownership, basically, over how they were assessed for the final in the class. So another way I try to add choice is by giving choices on essay exams, or by allowing students to decide which assignments they complete. So for example, in the spring, I created 5 possible written program assignments for my students. Each one did have a specific due date in the syllabus. Students were required to complete 3 of those 5. So this way they could choose which ones they wanted to complete, and it allowed for a lot of flexibility for the students based on their own schedules. And for the most part, I really didn't have to grade all of them at one time. So that was also kind of nice for me. But this allowed students who had still full-time jobs happening in the spring, or adjusting to having their children at home in the spring during COVID. It really allowed them flexibility to figure out how it is they were going to juggle all of those things. And it worked out quite well. So that's really all that I have today. We have some additional resources, and like I said, I'll pop those links into the chat window. But if Lauren and Gina have anything they want to add, they're welcome to speak up.
Thanks, April. So we've sort of been like talking in the chat as you were talking, just piggybacking on some of the things that you were talking about. Gina popped in a book recommendation. I don't know if everybody saw that. So the book that she I think just purchased this based on some of the talking and planning that we've been doing. The Remix, it's called. It really has been, it's a great resource to help strengthen your teaching. I think one of the challenges right now is being a good teacher and being a good remote online teacher, right? So professors now are balancing these 2 different, ideas, or these 2 different, personalities. So the strategies that April talked about today, we're currently using in our coursework, and we've been using in our coursework since the ABA program started, which was, I want to say 2 to 3 years ago. And this has been one of the hardest things that we've been dealing with. Is we have students who have come back to school after establishing careers and parenting, or being grandparents, and they're in the same space as young or younger millennials, and we've had to really find a way to meet both needs at the same time. So this is sort of where these ideas have been born out of.
I also want to say there's some chat about stereotypes, and I'm really, I'm the type of person where if it doesn't seem to apply to me, I don't get it. But if it does, I do. And in this sense, when I read Lindsay Pollock's book, The Remix, I really found like, oh, okay, a lot of this is very, very true and very, very relevant. So we're not talking about stereotypes per se, but particular just suggestions on how to really create online spaces that are friendly to all. And I think that's what we're always trying to do, right? We're trying to create online spaces that are open and accessible and that really feed into everyone's learning style. So instead of like generational, I'm always thinking like learning style, learning type, and about creating online spaces open to all.
Yeah, and I think, so I appreciate that too, Gina, that you said that. And of course, we want to be careful with carrying around stereotypes. At the same time, recognizing that people come with differences in their history allows us to meet them where they are and provide the supports that are needed based on their strengths or their areas of continued focus. And Gina and April and I have been writing a lot about this, multi-generational classrooms and racially diverse classrooms and cultural responsive education. And one of the first steps in all of this is being aware that our students come to us with differences based on their history. So the history of somebody who is a baby boomer is a lot different from a student who is considered a millennial. I still sort of smile when I say millennial because I feel like they're like 17-year-olds riding skateboards. And I think that just means like I've gotten older. But that's sort of the first step, right? Is acknowledging that I see that there are differences here and it's my responsibility to meet you where you are. And sometimes that's hard. I teach a class of 30 students. It's a research class. Everybody comes with different histories. So I'm making sure that I'm applying these tactics to meet everybody where they are all the time.
I do. I see it as an extension of UDL, an
Yep.
extension of culturally relevant teaching, because we are expanding the view of culture. So I think now we're going to open it to...
Yeah, I was just saying that we can stop the recording and maybe just open it up to comments and questions. And I'm just going to launch a quick poll. You can take it before